So let's start motivating when and why do we want to use machine learning. It feels like a no-brainer, but still you want to think about it. It's not like it's always machine learning, okay? In this case, why it was a no-brainer for machine learning? Well, we are studying a very complex systems. That is one reality. And then we'll tell what does this reality entail, okay? So protein alone is already very complex, as I said. The rule of the sequence structure function triology is there's no golden rule, okay? And then if you think about the whole system, actually it consists of a lot of molecules, including proteins that interact with each other hierarchically, right? They form pathways, cells, individuals, and populations, and so on, right? So it's a very complex system where the data are generated, okay? And then what? So when you want to model some complex systems like this, there are a bunch of challenges. One is the computational scalability, right? So it's one thing to predict a single protein structure and dynamics. It's another thing about predicting a pair of protein or tens or hundreds of proteins interacting with each other. And it's another thing to model all these proteins and the molecules within the cell, right, toward the function. So the scalability is one issue that you have to think about for your method. And the second thing is intrinsic complexity, okay? So think about it. We already simplified a lot of things, made a lot of assumptions when we solve protein structure prediction as an energy minimization problem for using the molecular mechanics. We already made a lot of assumptions about the independence between, the electron and neutrons, and we can separately model them, right? The charge-charge interaction, dipole-dipole interaction. We sort of, put them into different categories of interactions, and then even that is sophisticated and it's depending on the environment, like the pH, the crowding effects, and so on, right? I remember, was that Heymin who asked me before, like, what was that number on the amino acid two-dimensional graphs, right? The number was the pKa, which is the critical pH values when the proton will be lost, right? So it's very complicated, right? And the protein function, you have to actually consider the location, where it happens. Is it a dimer or oligomer? And is it partner specific? So it's very sophisticated. Just think about yourself. How do you describe your function, right? Right? So in different contexts, when you are interacting with different people, you are fulfilling different functions. So, and on top of that, we have the incomplete knowledge. This very famous quote from, you can tell me who it's coming from. There's known unknowns and there's unknown unknowns. Who's this quote coming from? Well, we have a war starting today, actually. And this quote was made years ago when another war started. Okay, you can find it out, okay? So, in short, the conclusion is that you believe that you can collect more and more data and understand the system more and more so that you would have a very sophisticated, gigantic model describing the complex system, and you're just trying to make sure that happens. Well, it's very difficult, okay? If you learn control, you know that the best control strategy is not necessarily built upon the built upon more detailed description of the system, okay? Sometimes it depends on the resolution of the data. So, based on this conclusion, what machine learning is trying to do is the following. Machine learning is extremely powerful when you have a system, a complex system, but you have a lack of laws and details, right? As you said, you don't even know all the components involved, and you don't know how they're interacting with each other in details. Or sometimes you have a law, the energy minimum principle, but you don't have the details to calculate the Schrodinger equation in a reasonable time, right? In contrast to the lack of laws and details in this natural system, you have abundance of data. This data is the paired input-output examples. So you have a lot of I/O pairs. So this is the system that machine learning got to be the way, because it's too hard to be modeled precisely following principle, because there's a lack of principle and details. But in the meantime, you have abundance of data. So now let's look at this system, right? This is a natural process, right, whose input includes x and x prime. And x and x prime, let's think about this process as a causal process, okay? And x and x prime can result in the output. Let's call it y or f of x and x prime. But you don't know who x prime are. Or you have no way to measure x prime. So all you have are a bunch of x and f of x, x prime pairs. Okay, so that's what you have. So based on such data, your goal is to construct an artificial model using some learning algorithm and domain knowledge, right? And you want to make a prediction from x, notice that it's from x alone, to the prediction y hat or h, right? And usually you want to construct such or train such model to replicate the observed I/O relationships from the natural processes. Once you have such model trained, then you can make these predictions with different x inputs, right? So this is what machine learning is good at, okay? So many of you have taken or are taking machine learning courses, so I'm not going to repeat too many repeated knowledge, but I just want to remind you that there are a lot of things that are important in machine learning, including theories, okay? And we know already from optimization that theories are really important, like convergence, convergence rate, complexity. They actually help us in the way of developing algorithms, because without them, it's hard to guide your development. Is that right? Because you can only trial and error, but that price is something very expensive. So, you have learned bias variance trade-off, right? Have you? Bias variance trade-off? Yes. Okay. So this is a very important concept, and we'll discuss them more in details. But I believe you have learned and or are learning, right? I know more than 2 or 3 of you are taking machine learning course this semester, right? So there's a very important concept about the complexity of the model and the generalizability of the model. So that's what the trade-off is trying to address. And then knowing that the complexity is important to the generalizability, then we can regularize or control the complexity to affect the generalizability, right? That's this will be discussed, right, and at least repeated in this lecture, in our courses. Then there are a lot of other things, right, including the time complexity, including learnability, right? I believe that pack learnability is definitely mentioned or will be mentioned in machine learning with networks. So probably approximately correct, pack learnability. So these are the theories involved. And I have very incomplete list of machine learning algorithms, because here these are just focused on supervised versus unsupervised. But you can also think about the different modalities, right, involved. And here I just put everything under deep learning, but you know that it's way more than that. So luckily, we have a whole third module, right? Almost 50% of the lectures on the deep learning part, okay? All right, any questions so far as we start on this part? Okay, let's have a formal setup, okay? So as I said, what we have is a list of paired x and y as input and outputs, okay? So let's say the input data is drawn from a space x, and the output, also called label or target, is drawn from a space y, okay? So x is also called the feature space, right? Sometimes you can roughly say that each dimension is a feature, but it also depends because sometimes people think that x, each dimension is just the attribute. So what feature means is something that you extracted from the attributes. So those are just the names. So if the space, the target or the label space, output space is finite, then we're talking about a classification problem. Right, you have finite number of labels, but if it's continuous, we're talking about a regression problem. And the unknown function we're going to try to learn is from x to y, so it's a mapping between the two spaces. And as I said earlier on, we are given a set of I/O pairs. So the input is xi, it's bold-faced, meaning that it's a vector. And the output is y sub I, meaning that it's a scalar, it's not bold-faced. So for now, we just consider a scalar variable, sorry, a scalar label. And we have n such so-called examples, okay? Paired input-output relationships, okay? So imagine that you are a hiker, you are a tea drinker, you notice that, right, the time needed to boil water to make your tea is different when you are at home or when you are at the top of the mountains, right? Though right, you may not know the details of the physics yet for now, okay, I'm assuming, but of course in this case, the physics is not that sophisticated, so you don't need machine learning to tell that. But anyway, let's say this was before the discovery of that physics. So what you can do is, you can just look at different locations and measure the pressure at that location, that's the input, and also measure the boiling temperature of boiling point at that location, that's the output. Then you can find out that there's some, almost linear. You don't need machine learning, but your brain is already doing human learning. There's a model you think that, oh, it looks like linear, right? Believe it or not, our brains are regularizing the complexity of the models with our own priors, okay? So we actually think that a linear model probably suffice, okay? But I think in machine learning, we are doing things in a more clear way. We don't know fully how brains function, okay? Okay, so this is a formal setup, and again, you have learned all this before. I don't want to talk too much about it. We are talking about the supervised versus the unsupervised, and then in the case of the supervised, depending on the label, we have classification versus regression, and then in the unsupervised, actually, I list some examples, but what is not included included this unsupervised learning and self-supervised learning in deep learning, so those will be partially covered in the deep learning module, okay? Okay, so let's see. Let me ask you a question. What kind of machine learning problem are we dealing with when we try to derive statistical potentials? Remember, we are using statistical potentials to replace the physics-based energy models like force fields so that we can optimize that function to find the best structure prediction. So what kind of learning algorithm did we use to derive the statistical potentials? Probability of the sequence, probability of the structure given the sequence. Well, what feature do you have for each structure? some kind of embedding of the structure, okay? But what label do we have? The label is how close this structure is compared to the native structure, which is the ground truth, right? If, let's call it RMSD, root mean square deviation. Remember when we compare the structure similarity, we use the root mean square deviation, okay? So if I use the root mean square deviation as a label and learn a function to reconstruct such relationship, I am doing a regression problem, right? But I could also classify this, binarize the label based on the root mean square deviation, right? That's what David Baker did in the earlier Rosetta. So they look at the root mean square deviation. If it's less something, they say it's near native. If it's bigger than something, it's not native. And then he used a logistic regression for the classification problem, right? So binary classification. So it depends, okay? Now, what kind of learning are we talking about for protein function prediction? Is it supervised, unsupervised? Is it classification or regression? Huh? Unsupervised. Supervised. Okay. Why? Why unsupervised? There's a huge amount of data that is not labeled. Okay. I see what you mean. Okay, let me explain a little bit. Sorry for the confusion. When I put no labels down there below unsupervised learning, what I meant was not that what you want to predict for does not have labels. What I meant was that in the process of making a prediction or learning a model, there's no label data you utilize. You see what I mean? So when you construct that model for machine learning, there's no Y. There's only X. I'll give you one example, right? For instance, I look at Google Earth image of the world at night, right? Then I see a lot of lights, right? And then the size of, the intensity of the light is like how much human population is there, right? Activities are there, activities, not necessarily population, because there are populations who don't have a lot of access to electricity, right? And then the size is sort of showing the metropolitan area size, right? So in that case, my X are what? Locations and intensities of these lights, right? And I do clustering and I found the big cities, right? So I didn't use any Y. You see what I mean? So in that case, we say it's unsupervised, okay? So is that clear? Okay, so I'm gonna come back to you, okay? So let's ask Do-Young again. Why do you think it's a supervised learning problem? Good. So you're saying that, oh, we do have some percentage of protein sequences whose functions are already labeled, right? Okay. Then is that a classification problem or regression problem? What are the labels? Is the label space discrete or continuous? Discrete, because we are looking at geo terms on the gene ontology, right? So in that sense, you can say it's discrete or classification. But you can also, just like logistic regression, right? It's for classification, but it calculates the continuous probabilities in each class. So in this case, you can also do this multi-class classification, right? Okay, but now, thank you for the answer. Now let's come back to what Ryan said. Actually, it's also correct. Because there are a lot of data for protein sequences without labels yet. So does that mean we cannot use them? Can we still use them? How do we use them? Can you cluster proteins based on their gene expression? Then you assume that genes in the same cluster should have the same or similar function. Then that's also an approach, right? So in reality, you could combine these things together, okay? So it's not, it depends on your formulation. It's not a fixed scenario. So there's no single correct answer for this question. I hope this shows you this is part of your design, okay? All right, so as I said, protein function prediction, it can be a supervised classification problem where the input are the features and the output are labels, which are the leaf terms of the geo terms. So it's the most detailed gene ontology, so it's supervised classification. It can be supervised regression, right? The labels is likelihood between 0 and 1 for each leaf, but it's not really regression. It's still classification, okay? But what you predict, it can be different, right? Another one is unsupervised classification. You can group related genes based on the similarity, right? And this also can be semi-supervised. In other words, you can use unlabeled test set, including, so you can also use unlabeled test set. In other words, for the test set, you don't know their labels, but you can use their features. And then you can use the semi-supervised learning, right? You have learned what semi-supervised learning means, right? Okay, so, all right, let's, I don't have to say too much about it, but in the case of the supervised learning, right, what you usually do is that you process the data and split the data into the training and test set. You select the algorithms based on the kind of problem you deal with. Then over different choices of hyperparameter combinations, you will train the model, find the parameters based on the training set. And then you will evaluate over the validation set. What they say test here, I think should be validation or development. And then you find out which hyperparameter is the best, and the optimal parameters also associated with that best hyperparameters. And then eventually you find a best model or ensemble of models, and you can deploy that, okay? So when you choose an algorithm, you can, based on evaluating the performances, cross-validation, leave one out. If you are taking pattern recognition course, you will learn about more details and theoretical aspects, especially when the sample size is small, whether cross-validation or leave one out is still a good idea. So you will learn a lot, okay, from Professor Braganetto in that course. And then you could also do the statistical comparisons, right? For instance, ROC curve for classification. We're going to remind you again for that. Okay, so how to represent the input? I said I asked this multiple times, and we have seen an example in the threading problems, and we also asked you a couple of times about how do you represent the protein structure for a deep learning model, right? So, and that actually determines your model choice, right? Do you represent them as point clouds? Do you represent them as a rigid body, so it's just a volume? Do you represent them as just a surface, right? Manifold? You could have different choices, right? Indeed, they are being represented in different ways, right? Or you represent them as graph with residues interacting with each other on the nodes, right? So we learned this before, that you could represent. So I know that we talk about the fact that we can use end-to-end models, right? And similarly, feature engineering can be reduced, but honestly, feature engineering is still very important. It's important to have the domain meaningful features, okay? Because if you want your model, naive model, to learn such knowledge directly from abundant data, it's very difficult. Okay, give you one simple example. If you don't tell the model in a way that, this label is invariant to the translation of the object X. For instance, however I translate the image or the cat in the image, it's still a cat. Sorry, did I say translate? Rotate, sorry. Right? So convolutional neural networks can achieve the translational invariance. That's not a problem, right? So we'll talk about this in more details. But it doesn't know rotational invariance, does it? Right? So how do people usually teach a convolutional neural networks about the rotational invariance? Usually they just have to let this model learn from a lot of data. For each XY pair, you randomly rotate X many times and so-called augment the data set, training set, right? Then the model hopefully sees that, oh, I have so many examples that their X are different but rotated relative to each other and their Ys are the same. Okay, but still, it's a very low it's a very low efficiency. Okay, and there's no guarantee that it's, not to mention that you're making this learning process extremely painful, okay? And so for that sense, you do have to do some feature engineering sometimes, and that does matter, okay? So we talked about this before. You can represent them in sequence, profile, and structure. But even for sequence, right, so there are a lot of things than just doing a one hot, right? In homework 3, you were learn something about it. You will see how you choose your input representation really matters. If you just tell them that, oh, these are just 20 different letters, then it's extremely difficult for the machine learning model to figure out how to assign a sequence to a label. Because it has no idea that this letter actually corresponds to a hydrophobic small residue, and that letter is also a hydrophobic but a bulkier residue. It has no concept at all. Imagine that the first time you learn the alphabet, if you just look at these 26 letters, right, what can you say? The only thing you can say is they are different. Okay, you have no knowledge. And how many examples after that did you need to finally have a concept, right? But in that case, we still have rules, right? So it's important to represent the inputs and incorporate the domain knowledge. So the domain knowledge is in your input. It's first of all in your design or formulation of the problem. Then it's in your input. Then it's also in your model architecture accordingly. So that's where you can introduce the domain knowledge. And lastly, what I didn't say was the last function, the objective function, right? That's one of the most important things for the optimization problems. You could represent inputs differently than just using features, okay? Instead of just represent each X with a lot of features, you can actually also use something called kernels. Okay, kernels is, you can roughly think of it as a distance, okay? So in other words, I don't tell you what is the coordinate of each sample X in the space, but I do tell you what's the distance or similarity or dissimilarity between a pair of examples, xi and xj. You don't know what are the coordinates or the features of xi and xj, but you do know the distance or similarity or dissimilarity between xi and xj. Is that clear? So that's what the kernel representation means, okay? And this could be a Euclidean distance in the protein feature space, but this can be a bad choice, right? Because you stack all the different features into a space, and then different dimensions can be different types of variables, and the scales are different. If you just use the Euclidean distance in that space, it doesn't make any sense, right? But in your applications, very often, people have some domain knowledge defined distance concept, right? Like in our structure similarity, we know how to measure structure similarity, right? So in other kind of analysis, you have some idea about what similarity means, right? So you want to teach that to the machine learning model, right? Then this kernel representation is another way. We'll actually see the kernel representation in the support vector machines again, okay? So, and I want you to carry that powerful concept when we review the kernel methods, and how we carry that on all the way to deep learning. That's another very active line of research. Okay, so yes, as I said, these kernel methods are very often used, like k nearest neighbors, right? You don't care about the features. All you care about is who are my neighbors, right? And then the support vector machine as well, actually. It's a kernel method, okay? All right, so now let's finish this motivation part about why you want to do machine learning, right? Generally, if there's a lack of general laws or specific details for a very complex system, but for that system you have abundance of I/O data, then it's a perfect scenario for machine learning, because you can construct an artificial model to reconstruct the I/O relationship and try to make generalization. So that's when you use machine learning, okay? But you don't use machine learning to discover a principle or, F equal to MA from data, because you already know that. You just want to incorporate that directly into your model, okay? And then we talked about a feature, label, training set, test set, different kind of learning scenarios, and what theories and algorithms might be involved, mostly in the shallow, because the deep learning part will be in different module.